Good morning or good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you're joining us from, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Eugenia, and I'll be your host. It's our pleasure to have Conductix-Wampfler with us today, who will be presenting this webinar titled Bringing Cranes into the Digital Age. Today's guest speaker is Brian Cook, Senior Product Manager. Now I'll provide some housekeeping information before we start. First of all, I would personally like to welcome you to our webinar platform on 24. You will notice that this webinar is browser-based, so if you disconnect for any reason, please just click on the link that you received via email to rejoin the session. During today's event, there will be plenty of time to ask our speaker questions. You can do that via the questions widget on the left-hand side of your screen. Just type your question in this box and click Submit. We will allocate some time at the end of the session to answer any questions or any thoughts that you may have. If you require any assistance, please use the yellow Help widget. In addition, you can move, resize, and maximize any of the windows in front of you to get a better view of the slides. And now, please allow me to welcome Brian. Over to you.
Hi, Eugenia. Thanks for the introduction. As Eugenia mentioned, my name is Brian Cook from Conductix-Wampfler, and today we're going to be we're doing a webinar, and we're going to discuss bringing cranes into the digital age and how the evolution of crane controls will streamline your business. You know, as far as the overview here, we're going to talk about overhead cranes and kind of the different variations that we see in the market. Then we're also going to go through the current state of crane modernizations, kind of the different types of crane radios, and then some innovations in the crane radio space, and 5 questions to ask to determine the best crane remote for your business. You know, I like to start off by kind of discussing overhead cranes, just really generally, because overhead cranes are used everywhere throughout the many different industries, right? So we have everything from steel and aluminum production to port industry and even to general manufacturing. And when we think about cranes, there's also a lot of variation within that, right? So there are specialized cranes, there are more standard cranes, but there's a few main types of cranes as far as structure. So when we think about it, we have bridge cranes, which is what a lot of us think of when we think of like an overhead crane. You can get those in either a single or a double girder. And then you have gantry cranes where you have 1 or 2 legs that are free moving. You have monorail cranes, then jib cranes. You see a lot of those in workstation, and then workstation cranes, which you see a lot of those in like light manufacturing facilities, and even in main manufacturing or large production facilities. You'll see a lot of those for a lot of the side processes. And when it comes to overhead crane, there really needs to be a big focus on safety and productivity, right? Because this equipment is really mission critical in many manufacturing processes to be successful and to make that product. And that leads to a very cautious approach by many customers because you can't afford to have your processes disrupted or your system be down. And, you know, when we look at it, and the reason we talked about crane controls is really the radio remote is one of the prime things to look at when you're looking at upgrading your overhead cranes, because it's really the primary interaction between the crane and the operator. And in many cases, it's the only interaction between the crane and the operator. So it's a great spot to look at. As far as the current state of modernization, it really varies quite a bit. If you think about how long overhead cranes last, many of these systems can last for 25 years plus easily. And if you think about what has changed since, 25 years ago, roughly 1998, a lot of equipment when this was designed, we were still using flip phones, we had dial-up internet, and there's really been a rapid technology advancement in this time. And so it's important when we look at this that there's a lot of opportunities for modernization. And even within the industry, you'll notice there's a lot of variation as to how far companies have modernized their controls, right? So if we think about a big one that comes up is like steel mill facilities, right? So if you think of like an integrated steel mill, some of these places are still using DC cranes with resistor banks and contactor-based controls. And then that goes all the way up to some of the newer electric arc furnace applications where they're using VFD drives with Ethernet-based automation solutions, and everywhere along the way, right? So a lot of customers are just really beginning this process. And today we're mostly going to be talking about controls, communication, and some of the sensor solutions that are out there today. But it really starts fundamentally with the power, right? So for conductor bar systems, it's taken a long time to even get to where everyone's ensuring that they have ground bars on all their systems and moving away from angle iron conductor systems to true conductor bar based systems. And when you go through this and you get the right solution, you start looking at a lot of the CMA regulations. You want to make sure that voltage drop conditions are being met, that ground bar has been added. And in reeling systems, a lot of people, when they think of a reel, they often think of like your traditional spring-driven solutions for basic applications. But as you start moving up into high-duty applications, there's a lot of different motor-driven solutions. This can be anything from a mag coupler to VFD drives. And as you start getting into this, you really have to integrate that into the controls package for whatever you're deploying on that modernization. And then also festooning systems, right? So a lot of these things seem simple, but even with a festoon system, it really comes down to you have to make sure that you're selecting the right trolleys. Do you have the right cables? And are you following best practices for stacking? And this really comes into play in modernizations, because as people move away from just traditional contactor or simple control systems and they start adding more advanced controls or Ethernet cables, you really need to pay attention to how those systems are being put together in the cable package for festooning systems. But when we're talking about modernization, I think the number one most important thing that people really want to look at is going to be safety, right? And it starts with personnel, certainly, first and foremost. We want to make sure that our people are safe, but it's also about the equipment, right? And when we look at safety, a lot of the things that are coming out now are really focused on the environment that we live in today. And that is, there's a lot of turnover in the industry, right? So that leads to people with less experience. So in the past, maybe you would have a guy or a gal, someone who would be operating it, who would have 10, 15, 20 years experience operating the crane. But we know that turnover is much higher. So a lot of the nuance when it comes to control, it's hard to learn that quickly, and maybe the people are cycling in and out before you're even able to get them trained up. Simple things like just understanding how much the load weighs, when to slow down as you're approaching where you want to place your load. Those are really key things that new operators really need to be trained up on. And when we get into the sensors and systems, there's really a lot of systems out there now for safety. So this can be collision avoidance systems like our Power Guard system from Conductix. Where you're looking at crane to crane, crane to the rail stop, or even looking at below the hook obstructions. Because the key is that you want to have the operator focus on the load and the surrounding equipment and personnel and spend less time worrying about how close they're going to get. Is there a backup or a fail safe if they get too close, which a lot of those collision avoidance systems can help provide. Also, load cells. How does an inexperienced user know when they are overloading a crane, right? So there's a lot of ways to approach the output of a load cell, right? So it can be a scoreboard, which we see a lot of deployments of that, where you have basically a board mounted somewhere that gives that total load size. But there's also feedback on the radio, which I think is a lot more useful. You really want to have your operator having all that information kind of in their hand. And then some systems, they just limit movement. And we have found that sometimes that creates some confusion, because operator goes to move the load, it doesn't move. He calls the service team, his local crane service team, because he's not sure why it isn't moving, because they're not notified that it's an overload condition. So there's a lot of ways that you can approach that. Another thing that comes up a lot now with when we talk about safety is really using limit switches or positioning systems. And that's done to create no-fly zones, or areas where you want the overhead crane to not be able to travel, or maybe it can't travel when you're carrying a load. And this can be large equipment or racking or just different things that are going to obstruct the normal workflow. Another one that comes up is cameras. You're starting to see a lot more interest in cameras. I think the deployment is still fairly early. However, some of the caveat with that is going to be cab operated equipment. I think a lot of these large overhead cranes where you have a cab operated piece of equipment, they've been deploying cranes fairly early on. And the reason for that is they really want to have that 360-degree view so that you can cover any blind spots that the operator has while sitting up there. But in a lot of cases, you're starting to, well, I shouldn't say a lot of cases, you're starting to see more companies looking at how they can move operators out from the cab to like a control house where that actual operator isn't on the actual crane. They're sitting back in a control room. And that's where these cameras really become important, right? Because you need to have complete coverage of what you're lifting. You need to have low latency so that you can really work in these environments. And a lot of the driving factors for the applications are going to be just the unsafe environments, right? You know, anytime you start getting to like high heat near a blast furnace, we've even had customers approach us about working in radioactively hot zones or warm zones, and then areas where you have acid or chemical fumes. And sometimes it's even just getting out from underneath a load, like traditional log handling cranes, moving the operator from being slung out underneath there back to a safe environment should you have a failure. Another set of sensors that we look at are going to be load stability or like anti-sway, you know, applications or sensors that provide feedback to indicate to a user that you're doing an unsafe move, right? So you're preventing a side pull, you have a misaligned load. And really this comes down to, you know, working with less experienced users. You know, again, someone who's been doing this for 15, 20 years, it becomes second nature to them. But when you're having to cycle people in and out, you know, with the turnover rate, it really becomes important that if they're not doing it right, obviously training is going to be the first thing you want to do. But the second thing you want to do is you want to have that backup, that fail safe that says, hey, you were doing something that isn't safe. And how do you notify the user? Again, we've seen a lot of different ways to do this, from notes on a radio screen and audible alarm, just alarming to indicate that you are doing something unsafe, or again, limiting movement. But you can see these are a lot of the sensors that are out there, and this is just a small sampling of what is out there when we look at safety. Another key thing when we think about safety is moving to radios from pendants. And the reason for that is radios really give operators freedom of movement, which means they're able to be further away from the load. They can be out of possible pinch points. A lot of the manufacturing facilities that we go and visit, they're very congested environments, right? So it's hard to expand. And so it's important for an operator to be able to get out and walk around the load and find the best spot where they can see the load and see, you know, what things they need to be aware of in their environment. Another thing that drives that is going to be the increase in ergonomics. You know, if you think of a traditional pendant station, you know, it's this very long yellow brick that is almost the size of a baseball bat with all your different controls, depending on how many you have. But, you know, having those radio controls really puts that in the palm of your hand, gives you that freedom of movement, but those ergonomics, it's a lot easier to actually drive those. And again, I think the other advantage is getting information from the crane to the operator, having that feedback to the operator. Now, depending on what radios you're using, this can be as simple as just some LEDs indicating a state of the crane, or all the way up to full screen solutions, depending on how much information you need in the hands of your operator. And, you know, safety is always, like I said, the number one thing, but with safety usually comes production, right? How much productivity can you get? And having these two systems, you know, once you add safety systems, you typically are going to get more production. And the reason for that is that confident users operate with higher productivity, right? They don't have to be tentative as they approach where they're going to place the load, because they know they can, with their experience, they can place it there, but they also have that backup system that allows them to have a little more confidence. Because really, when we look at safety and productivity, they're tied together, right? Because Anytime you have an accident or an event, you have downtime, right? So that's unscheduled repair time. And then having those sensors also builds up towards automation, right? And that can be full or partial automation solutions. When I say fully automated, that's a process that has minimal variation, where you're basically repeating the exact same thing over and over again, which there are a lot of places that use that. But I really think partial automation solutions is where we're really going to see a lot of growth. As companies start modernizing and adding these sensors, you're going to find that within the workflow, there's going to be repetitive tasks that can be done that you can automate, but there's always going to be a spot for, a non-standard workflow where it isn't just the same thing over and over again, where you do want to have the operator doing that because you want to have that intelligence of a person operating it. But those, the mindless task where you're doing that same thing over and over again, that's really where that comes into play. And when we think about safety and productivity, another product that really comes to mind is going to be maintenance zones. So as you start having multi-crane runways, you really need to look at how you're going to maintain and service that equipment. Because overhead cranes are unique compared to a lot of other, manufacturing equipment. If you think of a press or something like that, you turn off the power, you turn off the circuit breaker to that, and you don't have to worry about that piece of equipment becoming energized. With an overhead crane, you do still have to be aware of that if you have a multi-crane runway where you're creating a maintenance zone, right? Because almost all overhead cranes are going to have a tandem collector setup, which means that if you have just a single isolation break, you can have that tandem collector actually bridge that maintenance zone and energize it. That's why when you're working with providers, it's important to look for companies that offer power isolation sections that create that buffer zone to prevent that accidental electrification. And second part of that is you need to make sure you have the correct switch gear that individually isolates each section and can ground the maintenance zone. Because what you want to do is you want to have safety for your maintenance team or your crane service provider, if it's not something you guys do in-house. You want to have safety for them, but it's also about having that productivity, right? I don't want to shut down a 3-crane runway because this crane needs to have its maintenance done. This allows you to be both safe and productive at the same time. The next part, when we talk about modernizations, we've talked about sensors. Really, the key linchpin here is going to be data communication. I mean, it is that crucial link, right? So you have sensor and you have camera information, but you need to have a reliable channel for this information to get back to wherever you're sending it, right? Because poor communication will lead to nuisance e-stops. First of all, that's going to decrease the efficiency. But I think the more dangerous part of this is it teaches operators to ignore warnings, right? If you have a system that gives you a bunch of nuisance e-stops and the operator learns, that's just a false alarm, I can keep going. At some point, it's not going to be a false alarm. So data communication is usually really critical in this. Traditionally, when a lot of these systems were being deployed, a lot of them used Wi-Fi. So, and this worked initially, as you started deploying these Wi-Fi systems, but now every piece of equipment that is in a facility is using Wi-Fi, and this leads to very congested channels. And we've seen a lot of places where the IT team, the local IT team at a facility, is actually coming in and taking over and creating plans for what channels are available to what equipment. And the other part that plays into this is, first of all, IT needs to own those channels. Also, if you look about what the actual physical layout of a lot of these environments look like, you really need to do an RF survey map, right? Because you have a lot of metal or dense material that can restrict transmission for Wi-Fi solutions. And so it's important that you understand what channels are available and what that RF environment is actually going to look like. And then a lot of people after Wi-Fi, they started moving towards leaky coax, which for those of you that are unfamiliar with it, it's basically a cable with slotted jacket that allows part of that Wi-Fi signal to. So It uses Wi-Fi technology, but it has limited broadcast direction and strength. Still, since you're radiating out into the environment, your local IT teams are going to need to be involved, and it can run into some of the same interferences as Wi-Fi. And that's, from that, you started to see slotted microwave guide technology, like the Profidat technology or Profidat Compact from Conductix. What this does is it utilizes Wi-Fi technology, but it's in an enclosed solution. So you don't have that signal leaking out. So this ensures that no signal is being radiated in or out of that. And this is important because with Wi-Fi and leaky coax, when you have those disruptions that increases latency, depending on what you have that set to on your PLC, that's where you start to get those nuisance e-stops. And so that's why a lot of people are moving away from Wi-Fi and leaky coax to slotted microwave guide technology and now Pli-Fi, such as Nexus BB, which is a power line fidelity data over power solution. The nice thing about this is it allows you to utilize your existing power conductors. And again, there's no radiated signals, so this eliminates local IT team support requirements. So again, those last two, it's really about reducing those nuisance e-stops and improving your data communication. And again, just radio controls, right? Moving away from pendant towards a load, having that ergonomic handheld system makes it a lot easier for operators that are driving the crane. And again, having that communication from the overhead crane to the operator through that radio, just giving some sort of communication as to what is being done, what they need to be aware of are very crucial. When we talk about crane radios, there's really four main types of crane radios. The first one that we'll look at is going to be really the simple occasional use application. So these are great for two motion or less occasional use applications. Again, these are typically smaller radio systems. Very often they're single speed, but you see a lot of these on like jib cranes, monorails, or workstations. And these do a good job. They're small, they don't take up a lot of space, but really just for occasional use applications. Probably the most common, I would say, these are your everyday crane remotes, right? So you'll see a lot of these on bridge cranes and workstations. And really, when you break down the everyday crane applications, we really look at it as there's really four main application types within this. And so that's going to be a standard 3-motion, 2-speed. This is what a lot of people think of when they think of an overhead crane. But as you start getting into larger loads or you start working at maintenance facilities, you'll start to run into applications where you have an auxiliary hoist, which we would call a 4-motion, right? So that means that the trolley, you have one trolley on the bridge, but it has an auxiliary hoist, and then it has your standard hoist. So sometimes the maintenance team will use this as they're moving small loads, or maybe it's a hard load and to carry, so it just gives them a little extra balance on there. And then you move into tandem trolley applications. And on a tandem trolley, you have one bridge, but you have two different trolleys moving in that can move independently of each other. You see a lot of these in larger loads, maybe longer loads like sheet material or construction materials. Those are pretty common. And then you move into tandem crane applications. And these are probably the most advanced of what I would call the everyday crane applications. And that's really where you have two separate bridge cranes that can be controlled together or independently. And you see a lot of these as you start moving into larger equipment. And, I think one of the things where you're starting to see now new radios on the market like the Airmark from Conductix, what we've done here is we've developed one radio solution that can serve all these applications. So allowing operators or facilities to standardize on one set of hardware makes it a lot easier from the support side, but also from the operator side. When you have that same radio control at all the different applications where you might be driving that within a facility, it really makes it a lot easier to kind of flex people back and forth in those work environments. Then we start moving on to what we would call the advanced handheld radios. You see a lot of these in bridge cranes and gantry cranes. When you move to this, when you move from the everyday crane remotes to the advanced handheld radios, we're really starting to talk about increasing that operator feedback. So it could be trying to get identification of what axis you're trying to control or what crane you're driving, or it could be the load cell feedback, or maybe it's positioning information that's coming back there. That's usually when we start moving into that. A lot of these radios also have a lot of advanced button mapping features. So whereas a standard crane remote, it's going to be wired up, you just wire it into whatever those motions are. When you start getting to these advanced radios, you can really customize with a manufacturer what each button should be doing. What do you want to have each of those actions be when you push it at both the first or second detent? And they're really engineered to the individual application. So we went from a standard product to something where we're really having a conversation with the end user or the crane service partner to make sure that we design it for that exact application. And you see a lot of these when you get into advanced below the hook controls, where you want to make sure that you have maybe the right rotate, being able to control speeds. There's just a lot of different options there. And then you also have the application where specifically once you've gone to automation, where we start to look at pick and control applications. And what that means is with the radio, maybe 90% of the time, this radio or this crane is going to be automated, but there may be certain special moves that you need to do, or you need to have the operator, or maybe it's only the maintenance team. And this allows you with a pick and control application where you can set it up so you just have basically one maintenance radio, right? And they can go through and pick the crane and then manually control it, bring it out of automation control during the times they actually need that. And then another one that comes up a lot with the advanced handheld radios is being able to have defined startup and control zones utilizing either limited radio power or IR sensors to control where you're actually going to be driving those vehicles or your crane. And then the top of the line or the most advanced one you start to see in a lot of process facilities are going to be what I would call a belly box radio. So it's an engineered radio, but with belly box controls. So you'll see these on bridge cranes and gantry cranes. And typically on here, you have the ability for either joystick or lever controls. And again, those are engineered to application. You can have a lot of additional switches added on there for any sort of accessories that you need to control or overrides that you need to have. And you see these when you have a lot of really precise multi-axis controls being needed. And the other thing that I would note is that you're starting to see, when we look at the change in the workforce, I think levers used to be a lot more common. But with the younger generation coming in, you're really starting to see people pivot towards joysticks. If you think about, how people interact on a touch phone or a touch screen on their phone or through a video game system, really that's become kind of the preferred mode for kind of those advanced radio control solutions. The next topic we have is innovation in crane radio. So a lot of people, if you haven't looked at radio controls in a long time, you might be surprised at all the different solutions that are out there in the market now. And at a lot of entry-level price points or kind of really value-added solutions, right? And this starts with adaptive frequency schemes. So if you had a radio system 20 years ago, which you probably remember, and this is still very common and usually the default for most, is you have a fixed channel, right? So within the frequency set, you set it to a fixed channel and you drive you control the crane, operate the crane with that in that set channel. But now we have new options on many radios, such as a channel scan. So with this option, what you do is you put the receiver in basically a listening mode and run it for a couple minutes, and it can tell you which channels are open, right? And this is really helpful as you have a lot of people cycling in and out of a work environment. You may not know what channel all those radios are set to, but you can use that channel scan feature to automatically find and set those. You also have the free channel startup. And what this does is a free channel startup, the receiver is always powered and listening, and it'll always select a free channel based on what it's heard over the last minute or two. Again, this ensures that you have that consistent communication. And then a lot of the systems even now have the frequency hopping. So it's an adaptive frequency management algorithm, which will actually look as a load is being moved, the receiver can actually sense, hey, I'm starting to hear some interference on this channel, and it'll tell the transmitter to switch over to the next channel to maintain that strong communication. Another thing that really comes down that it's very important is ergonomics on this, right? So easy to hold for both large and small hands. And it really comes down to reducing repetitive task injuries if it's due to button reach or button pressure. Those really help the users. We have a lot of safety features. I touched on that a bit earlier, right? So this can be everything from simple things such as safety features, just identifying which crane is being operated with a horn, lamp, or projector lights, having an e-stop switch, either on a pendant or a radio that's easy to reach. And then when we get into tandem controls, this is a feature that's very important. When you look at a tandem control, you're talking about controlling two crane radios together. So it's important when you start looking at these that you look at something that's designed from the ground up for that. So you're going to be looking for features such as linked receivers, which give a sign of life between the two receivers on the crane and the transmitter. And what this does is this ensures that you don't have a condition where one of the cranes is stopping and the other one is driving when you're under control. So when you look at that, make sure you find a crane radio provider that understands the real need of a tandem solution. And then you start getting into specialized controls, and a lot of these are like a dual action control. You want to have two actions for like a magnet or vacuum handling. That way you don't accidentally open or release a load. And even now we're starting to see more requests for solutions such as operator login. This can be a PIN code or a card to ensure that they have the right operators actually driving the crane. And then when you start to get into some of the solutions, you're also looking at redundant controls for e-stop or functions. We talked about data communication. Another thing that's really changed with the radio solutions now is we're really starting to move away from relay-based controls to some of the new radio manufacturers have direct native Ethernet control where you're actually integrating this into your control pathway, which gives a lot more functionality and user, it just makes it easier for the user to actually interact with it. And a lot of that comes back to the radio display. When you have something integrated into the Ethernet control, it allows you to put more information in the hands of the operator. This can be things like load cell information, understanding how much weight you're actually lifting, equipment identification, what crane are you controlling or what axis is under control, or positioning information. In manufacturing facilities, this makes it a lot easier to be repeatable. If you know that you're driving to a specific spot on the rail, if you have that position information noted and you have it appearing on the operator's radio screen, that allows the operator to drive very specifically to that and not have to guess if they have that spaced or in the right position. And then again, another big one is going to be error or alarm conditions like the load cell information, or maybe you're within the slow and stop boundary for a collision avoidance system. Putting that actually on the operator's screen gives them good indication to say, hey, I know why the crane is driving slow, or I know why I can't move. I've gotten too close to something. When we look at crane radios, one of the big questions we get are, what should I look at, or what questions can I ask to determine the best crane remote for my business? And, the first thing I would say is, what challenge are you facing with your current controls, right? A big one that we have is repetitive use injuries. Traditionally, people coming from pendants or maybe a larger radio systems from the past. We need to look at what that button pressure is, what that size and that reach is. But the big thing is reach out. If you're having a repetitive use injury, reach out to a manufacturer that has a wide portfolio. We want to understand that operator experience, right? Because we know that it needs to be easy to understand. I mentioned turnover. I read a study not too long ago that says some manufacturing estimates are as high as 39% for turnover in facilities. And that makes it really a challenge because an overhead crane, when operated safely, obviously they're very safe. But when you have someone that doesn't know what they're doing, there's certainly a lot of risk there, I would say. And when you have the radios and you have that screen on there, that really improves the operator experience because it lets them know if they're operating something outside of its standard or intended capacity. You also have to look at, for the operator experience, you really need to understand what controls do they like, right? So if it's a standard push button control, which is great for many application, even just getting a couple different radio samples on hand to kind of feel what that button pressure feels like. A lot of these are going to be 2-speed cranes, and you want to make sure that the operator can feel that first and second speed detent for the control. And then again, when you get into those advanced solutions, do your operators use lever or joysticks? What is going to be the most comfortable or easy to train your operators on? Then you really want to consider what is the radio remote functionality. And when you do this, you should really consider all radios in a facility. New products on the market like our AirMark radio can adapt to multiple applications. You can have one radio that serves a tandem crane, your auxiliary hoist applications, and your standard 3-motion applications, all with one SKU. And that makes it easier for maintenance teams to be on site and replace it. And then again, it's really easier for your new employees to flex to different areas within your facility. Next question is, you should really look at, is there replacement and repair support? As I mentioned earlier, cranes can last for 25 years. So you want to ensure you select a company that has local service and support for the product. Accidents can happen and radio transmitters get damaged, right? That happens, throughout many manufacturing facilities due to a number of reasons. So you want to make sure you have a company that'll be there to support it, but you also want to look at how do they support it? Can they make that radio easy to pair? There's new radios on the market now that are actually faster to pair than having to get up on and get your pendant down. So a lot of people would keep a backup pendant tied to the bridge of the crane, or maybe they have it in a maintenance facility. Well, some of the new radios on the market, you can actually pair a replacement radio quicker than you could get up there and get that pendant down, because you don't need to access the bridge. You don't need to drop power. You don't need any special tools. And when you think about repair support, it's also important to understand that the partner that you're with, have they been around for a while, but also do they have local stock? Is that something that you can call up and order and get a replacement shipped out in an efficient time? Because we're really talking about reducing downtime and reducing inefficiencies in the work environment. What are safety options? I've kind of hit this a few times already, but I think the number one thing for anyone that is using a pendant, it's really about moving to a radio away from a pendant. Pendants are great as a backup or for some very limited applications, but really you want to have your operator be efficient with the load, which means giving them the freedom to move 360 degrees around. This allows them to position themselves in the right environment. It's also about avoiding pinch points, right? You have a crane where you're moving a very large, heavy load at some speed. You want to make sure that the operator can move away. So if that load does sway, if they don't have experience, you don't have any safety sensors on there that prevent that, you want to have the operator be able to get out of that area. And as you look at safety, another thing that you should really take into consideration is, do they actually comply with regulations? So this could be the CMAA regulations, which the subdivision of that was ECMA, now renamed ACE. And when you're looking at that, there's a standard there, and it talks about how you want to have that crane radio set up. And one of the key things is having some sort of audible or visual indication of a crane under control. So when you look at a radio partner, you really want to find someone that provides a complete radio package, right? So some of the solutions out there on the market, you buy the radio, well, now you need to go buy a horn or a lamp that will indicate that crane is under control, or maybe they sell it, but it's an add-on. It should really be part of that base radio package, right? Because you need to have that to have a functional radio system that is in compliance with the ANSI standards. Another one that comes up quite a bit now is we're talking about operator access when it comes to safety. So as we start having a lot of different turnover in environments, sometimes people are actually moving to having like a PIN code or a login to limit who can actually drive the overhead crane or who can operate the crane. Also, some of the solutions out there allow you to operate the crane, but maybe they have a PIN code that limits who can access the settings. And this comes up a lot when you start moving into facilities that have a lot of cranes and they do a little bit of customization or different settings on there. And so what you're trying to do is you want to ensure that only qualified people can operate the crane. And you'll see this even in tandem applications where maybe they don't have a PIN code on there, but in those tandem applications, if it's not something that's regularly done by the operator, the crane radios can be programmed where you have a dedicated radio for crane A and crane B, but then you have like a dedicated tandem radio. And sometimes these will be locked up by the supervisor or just held by a certain operator that has maybe a little more qualification or someone who can manage those larger loads. We also see a lot more requests for creating an operator zone with IR modules. What this does is it ensures that when you're operating it with a radio, you have to be within the zone of that IR sensor. So this can be maybe there's a certain spot that you need to start, or maybe you want to make sure that the operators are staying far enough back from a load. So maybe you're placing that IR sensor back to kind of help drive home the best behaviors for your operator. And then explosive atmosphere or rating requirements. When we start thinking about safety requirements, is it going to be in a explosive environment for dust or gases? It's important that you find providers that can walk you through and help find the right solution for you. And again, the dual action controls I mentioned, specifically if you're working with magnet or vacuum lifting equipment, you want to make sure that it takes 2 actions to release a load. Compared to even older like motorized equipment like a grapple or something like that, because you have a little bit of time an operator does where they can reverse course, where once the magnet or that vacuum has released, that load is dropped. It is not, there's no recovery from that. So it's very important to look from the safety side when you have those specialized applications to make sure you're getting the right product for you. And what should you consider? I say you should really always look for companies that have a complete radio portfolio. There's several of us out there, right? If you go to a supplier that has a single solution, what you're going to get is they're going to tell you that everything that you have fits this one solution. You really want to find someone that can look at your needs and present that correct solution to you or your crane service partner. And you want to find someone that has experience in the crane industry, right? Just the simple things about understanding the tandem controls and how linked those need to be. Again, you get that from finding providers that work in that environment. And I also think it's important to really find a partner that can provide the data, power, and control all together, right? Because this simplifies support for either end customers or for the crane service companies, because that gives you one company that you can call for quote, for order, tracking down your orders and getting everything you need for the modernization system that you're going to be looking at. With that, I will open that up to some questions.
Oh, thank you very much for this presentation. Just a reminder to the audience to ask questions. You can send them via the questions widget. Just type them in this box and click submit. Please note that you can still send your questions after the webinar and they will be answered at a later date. And it looks like we've got several questions already. Okay, our first question is there a customer currently using iMark? If so, what has their experience been?
That's a good question. So I mentioned the new AirMark radio from Conductix-Wampfler. Yeah, we have several deployments of this at different overhead crane facilities throughout the United States. Our feedback on that has been very positive. People really like that it's simple, easy to use. But I think really the big thing that is driving customers towards that is the ability to serve those four main applications I talked about. The standard crane, auxiliary hoist, tandem trolley, and tandem crane with a single radio really makes it easier for the partners that we've worked with.
Okay, thank you. And our next question is, are these webinar sessions recorded and uploaded on social media, for example, YouTube or LinkedIn?
Yeah, both Cranes Today and Conductix-Wampfler will be promoting this on our social media channels after the webinar. I would guess I think it's about 24, 48 hours before we get the video on that, but then we'll start promoting it on there and make that available for people that are interested.
Thank you. All right, our next question is, are all of your crane radio remotes available for direct purchase?
Yes, all of our radios are available for direct purchase from Conductix. You can purchase our standard radios on the website. When we get into engineered radios, typically that always involves a conversation, right? We want to ensure that we are providing the right solution for that application. So we would have you contact us by phone or email. Also, I would say if you're an end user, we also recommend working with a local crane service company for the purchasing and installation. If you're not sure, you can reach out to us and we can help you find a partner. But it's important to understand that it has to be installed correctly also. They're fairly straightforward, but if you don't have people or time at an end user facility, crane service companies can do a really good job and really help you with a lot of your products.
Yep, thank you. Right, our next question is, how do tandem radio control systems work?
Yeah, that's a big one. As I was talking about in the webinar, tandem radio controls are really a specialized type of radio system, even though we put it in we have a solution that works in kind of that standard radio set. An important thing to look at here is that in this configuration, what a tandem radio application means is you have one transmitter, or at least one transmitter, paired to two receivers. The receiver is going to be kind of the listening and the acting end on the actual crane. And then on the transmitter, you select tandem control via either a rotary knob or a push button, and then you start the crane, right? As you're starting it up, you have to select which ones that you're going to have under control. And as I mentioned earlier, a safely designed tandem system really needs to have some sort of sign of life between the two receivers and the transmitter to ensure that tandem control will only function when all three pieces of the hardware are communicating. And this is important because if you have a tandem crane application, right, you have two cranes that are sharing a load. Typically, it's split between the two. And if that tandem system isn't set up correctly, where one crane receiver thinks it should keep going and the second one stops, you can have a very dangerous incident happen very quickly because now you have half of your load is moving and half of it is not. And at some point, something's going to give. So when you get a tandem radio control, they are very safe. You just have to make sure you find the right radio application for it, or the right radio solution for that.
Okay, thank you. And our next question is, how do I find a good partner for crane modernization?
Yeah, I would say start with your crane service company. If you have a local crane service company, that comes out and does the maintenance on there. Also, if there's other manufacturing facilities in the area, they can help guide you to someone who can be a good partner. If you're not sure where to start, you can also reach out to a full line supplier like Conductix-Wampfler. We can guide you to experienced partners in your area. I mean, Conductix has been working on overhead cranes since the 1950s, so we know a lot of the players that are out there. And if you're looking at modernization, we can guide you to people who have some experience. And if you tell us a little bit about what you're trying to do with that modernization, we might even be able to help narrow down who would be the best partner in your region for that.
Thank you. And our next question, how do I know my radio is designed for overhead cranes?
That's a good question. So really the questions you should ask are going to be about, do they have ECMA radio control compliance, or now ACE, through CMAA? So if you start asking about, you start asking those questions, if they can't direct you to how they're in compliance with that, that would be a pretty good clue that maybe they're new to that industry. Also just asking about their market experience, where they have deployments, and also asking about UL or CSA compliance, depending on if you're in US, Canada, or what other certification standards you would need in your local country.
Okay, thank you. Right. Do you have a company portfolio or case studies I can review regarding your industry expertise further?
Yeah, on our website, we have quite a few different case studies or reference reports for a lot of different applications. So if you're unsure, go to our website. I forget the exact spot we have them listed, but you can reach out to us and we can provide you some case studies or those reference reports most closely related to your industry.
Right. Thank you very much. And just a reminder that you can still send any questions while watching on demand. All questions will be answered at a later date. I would like to thank Brian for this presentation and Conductix-Wampfler for sponsoring this session. To the attendees, you will receive an email telling you how you can access the on-demand version of this webinar, or you can access this through our website, which is pmi-live.com. We look forward to sharing further webinars with you, so please do keep an eye on the website just mentioned. Thank you once again, and I hope you all have a nice day.